Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. We're really glad to see you all, and thank you very much for joining. Also, we would like to present S.Friedman, who is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher and artist, a scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. And also, we would like to give big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to give your feedback, ask questions, and we'll definitely address them in the end of the next session, as well as we're going to address the questions from the previous session today. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Eliot, for the introduction. Thank you very much for your participation in these talks, in moderating them and making them possible. Along with, I'd also like to extend my thanks to the American Consulate in Almaty, Dana, Elmira, everybody on the team that provides this platform on a weekly basis for exploring philosophical perspectives on virtually any conceivable topic, any conceivable issue. A lot of these talks, as I've emphasized, relate to international days of celebration, but not always. Sometimes they're done in connection to a significant historical figure, sometimes just in relation to some issue that I think merits addressing. I think next week's talk, for example, is probably, though I haven't fully determined the topic yet, but there's an International Wellness Day. So I might address the philosophy of wellness next week, but it's not decided definitively yet. But this week, the topic is the philosophy of fire. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about its spiritual significance, the spiritual significance in different traditions of fire, its philosophical tradition, its philosophical significance, but also some of the science associated with fire and our response to it. The topic is motivated partly by the circumstance that May 30th is the feast day of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a figure that I've referenced on many occasions during these talks. Joan of Arc's feast day, May 30th, coincides with the day of her death, the day on which she was burned alive at the stake. So her death was by fire. That obviously represents the horrific aspect. Fire has been used as an instrument of death, of torture, but again, also of spiritual transfiguration, both in physical terms and also metaphorically. Since this topic basically connects to Joan of Arc, I want to say a few things about her. I've, again, spoken about her a lot, but there's always more to say. And I wanted to reference the great American writer, Mark Twain. Let me show you some images. I'm always forgetting to show these as I'm proceeding, but now obviously Joan of Arc is not someone whose image has come down to us historically. So we have different representations. Here is an early representation of her, a painting of her, Joan of Arc. Mark Twain is here. The great 19th century American writer, humorist, one of the greatest of all writers and humorists, not just in the American literary tradition, but in the realm of international literature. He's celebrated for works like, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Some consider it the greatest single American novel. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a work that I've actually quoted from in the past, in relation to the image, the metaphor of Camelot as a perfect realm, a perfect world. But interestingly, most people are not familiar with this fact, this circumstance, Mark Twain's last major novel, literary work, was Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. And even though it sounds like it might be historical account, it was fiction, but it was fiction based upon extensive research that Mark Twain did over a 10-year period into her life, into the circumstances of her death. Joan of Arc is one of the most documented individuals in, well, late medieval, early modern history, the history of the 15th century. So there's a great deal of documentary material available that Mark Twain based his work on, though it's a work of historical fiction. Now, and Twain himself considered it his greatest single work. He was extraordinarily fond of that subject and his achievement in bringing it to life. Well, it's a long work, but it has a very short, what's called translator's preface, though it was written by Mark Twain. It's a preface to his work that merits reading. I recommend that all of you look up the translator's preface to The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Now, I'm just going to read you a couple of sentences from it to give you a sense of Twain's estimation of Joan of Arc. And as a great writer, his words are worthy of Joan of Arc's place in history. So, let me turn to this. Okay, just to show you, it's just a page. I'm not reading, I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from it. And the first sentence that I wanted to read, to find it, the character of Joan of Arc is unique. It can be measured by the standards of all times without misgiving or apprehension as to the result. Judged by any of them, it is still flawless. It is still ideally perfect. It still occupies the loftiest place possible to human attainment, a loftier one than has been reached by any other mere mortal. In other words, Twain's assessment of Joan of Arc is that she was the single greatest human being who ever lived. Now, the translator's preface continues and it gives basically Mark Twain's reasons for that assessment. But I refer you to we don't really have time to go into that here. And I also wanted to read you the final sentence from his appraisal. In the final sentence, which sort of leads us, and for all reward, the French king, whom she had crowned, stood supine and indifferent, while French priests took the noble child, the most innocent, the most lovely, the most adorable the ages have produced, and burned her alive at the stake. Again, that leads into the specific topic of tonight. Let me just read you one more thing that I'm not sure if I've read in the past. It's by the 19th century Hungarian politician. He was prominent in helping Hungary achieve independence from Austria, Louis Kossuth. And he wrote about Joan of Arc. Consider this unique and imposing distinction. Since the writing of human history began, Joan of Arc is the only person of either sex who has ever held supreme command of the military forces of a nation at the age of 17. So we get a sense of the magnitude of her achievement, the magnitude of her place in history, of her place in particular in French history, where she's considered the savior of the French nation during the 100 Years' War. Her final words, which also intersect tonight's topic: hold the cross high so that I may see it through the flames. And remember too, Joan of Arc was guided in her mission by voices that she attributed to prominent saints, in particular Saint Catherine of Alexandria, which is another point of convergence. For me, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, 4th century Christian woman, tortured to death for her learning, has emerged as the patron saint of philosophers. And in the books of Joshua, I actually pay homage to Saint Catherine and Joan of Arc in the following words. And Catherine sends her legions forth to embolden Joan on her journey north towards a trembling star. And her only trace is the wind on your face, blowing from afar. Okay, so obviously, fire is an instrument of horror, an instrument of death, but also, as I mentioned, of religious transfiguration, religious transcendence. Let's deal with that. The second thing that came to mind, once I had decided in relation to Joan of Arc that the philosophy of fire was a reasonable topic, was writings by the great American expatriate author, poet, literary critic, T.S. Eliot, a 20th century titan of American and world literature. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he was educated at Harvard, the Sorbonne in France, and Oxford in literature and philosophy. So his poetic writings are heavily influenced by his philosophical background, also by his religious readings and impulses. He himself was a Christian, but he was very much drawn to Hindu culture, and he uses lots of references in his writings to Hindu religious belief, along with Christian beliefs, motifs, metaphors, imagery. His final work, one of his greatest poetic works, and of all his writings, the one that I most embraced when I was really in high school and was reading T.S. Eliot, is called Four Quartets. I've referenced it in some earlier talks. Four Quartets is a work whose sections are inspired partly by the four main elements: earth, air, water, fire. And fire is the focus of the last of his four quartets. It's the one that in particular came to mind in relation to tonight's talk. I'm going to read you a couple of lines from it. But first, I want to play for you a recording of T.S. Eliot reading the four quartets. Now, it's where he reads it kind of slowly. It's not, I'm not sure, the most inspired of readings, at least as I hear when I read it to myself. I find the words more inspiring than translated through his voice. But just so we have a sense of what he was as a person, let me play just a little bit. I'm going to play from the beginning.
Present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been.
One thing you'll notice is the philosophical framing, the philosophical intensity of his writing. That is true throughout the four quartets. In addition, it's a confluence, as I said, of religious imagery, Christian, Hindu. So it's an amalgam. It's a convergent work, as poetic works in general are. But it also aspires to a degree of philosophical integrity, philosophical insight. Let me read you the few lines that address it's not a short work. It's not an epic poem, but in the printed version, I think it runs maybe 30 pages. So I'm just going to read you some excerpts from the final quartet, which deals with fire as a spiritual sort of force. And here that is. Oh, I should show you T.S. Eliot. The man that you were just listening to is photographed here. And here is the actual cover of the first edition of Four Quartets. It was published in the 1940s. Here are some lines from it that reference fire in particular, and that came to my mind immediately once I had this topic. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error, the only hope or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, the funeral pyre, important in Hindu culture, to be redeemed from fire by fire. We only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. He's talking about the passionate fire, the passionate burning of religious devotion, religious intensity. He's also talking about the fires of the hell fires that represent all the challenges, the burdens, the horrors of human life. He's also talking about the transfigurational fire of the funeral pyre that in Hindu culture affects the transmigration of the individual from this life to the next. That last image, based on the funeral pyre in Hindu culture, brings to mind the image of the phoenix, right? The bird that is consumed, but then out of the ashes, it arises again. So the idea that from death and destruction, there is new rebirth, new life. And fire is an instrument, is a vehicle of that passage, that transformation and transfiguration. A few other lines. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire, beyond the language of the living. Again, an intensity of communication and also an urgency. From wrong to wrong, the exasperated spirit proceeds, unless restored by that refining fire, where you must move in measure like a dancer. Again, the spiritual potential of fire as an agent of transformation, purification, sacrifice. The sacrifice to the gods in different cultures was effected often through fire. And then his closing lines, which encapsulates his sort of positive spiritual orientation, his embrace of spiritual possibilities as a solution to human circumstance and its limitations and challenges. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Where again, fire is a symbol of passion, religious intensity. The rose is a symbol of love, the love of God. Now, it's poetic. It is, to my ear, beautiful poetry. It's been influential in my own work. One thing about T.S. Eliot that also comes to mind whenever there's an occasion to read him or discuss him is in high school, in the 11th grade, we were studying poetry, American poetry, and we had to do a term paper. And I ended up choosing, perhaps not surprisingly, if you've been following along with many of these talks, Emily Dickinson as my subject. But the teacher said that if you chose T.S. Eliot, you would get extra credit because Eliot is considered one of the challenging, one of the difficult poets to come to terms with. And you can see why. He has references to lots of different, cultural features, elements, significances historically, and his mind has a philosophical bent, a philosophical orientation, and he's looking for answers. He's looking for solutions. Well, one thing I found in relation to the four quartets was a contemporary assessment. And I wanted to read you a couple of lines that summarize the spiritual impulse of what I just read and what Eliot was addressing throughout the four quartets. And let me turn to it. I have these things in slightly different places. Okay. So this is a work of literary criticism, contemporary literary criticism on T.S. Eliot, not being critical, but offering an assessment and a path to understanding of the work. The dead, with their words tongued with fire. Those words tongued with fire were in what I just read from the four quartets. Offer an alternative set of possibilities for the poet seeking to escape the fetters of reality. The fetters, the chains of reality, seeking freedom. By going to a place where prayer has been valid, Eliot proposes that imagination and a little faith can conquer the strictures, the prison, placed upon man by time and history. By allowing us a way to bypass the realities of our world, they open up a spiritual freedom. And then this essay concludes, poetry may suffer from language's inherent lack of precision, but it provides the aesthetic faculty with an opportunity to disregard human limitations, if only for a moment. Well, those words are words, the kind of things that we commonly hear in assessments of spiritual writing, spiritual impulses, spiritual approaches to the world, and spiritual solutions. And the theme is an escape from what seem to be irresistible realities of our world, the limitations of our world, ultimately limitations embodied in mortality, the types of limitations that Buddhism addressed, disease, old age, death, the sense of the past constraining the present and imposing limitations upon the future, upon future possibilities, and blocking our essential freedom, the freedom that we aspire to spiritually and try to achieve, as Eliot did, spiritually, through some mode or avenue of faith, of belief, of embrace, of a tradition that promises escape, liberation, salvation. It's all good and well. Philosophy, as I've been stressing, and I don't want to be too harsh, but makes it all literature, all irrelevant to the primary purpose that Eliot was devoting himself to: freedom, liberation from the past, embrace of human potential that exceeded what we had known, that exceeded our sense of limitation imposed upon us by our experience. Remember? What Eliot is describing, what the spiritual world or what the world that Eliot is seeking escape from constitutes, is the heuristic. It's the realm of concepts. That's the realm in which we generalize from the past into the future for purposes of what? Our survival, promoting our science, our technology, our culture. Ultimate freedom is philosophic. It's the freedom that rigor achieves, embraces, and achieves incontrovertibly, independent of any mode of belief, any avenue of faith. Rigor embracing what? The nature of the epistemic, the nature of difference. I'll teach you differences, as Shakespeare wrote, and as Wittgenstein affirmed. A is not equal to A. The fundamental condition of existence, of dignity, of freedom, of what religions seek as salvation, doesn't depend upon any mode of belief. It doesn't depend upon anything provisional. It depends upon the absolute embrace of rigor, which is incontestable by definition, that two things are not one, that the past cannot guarantee the future no matter what, and that the future decides the past. That those propositions represent the freedom that Eliot is seeking, and notice they represent that freedom without clothing things in spiritual metaphors or imagery. It's pure rigor. A is not equal to A. We exist in difference from everything else. Any two things are approximately the same for some purpose or other, but rigorously distinct. And that is our freedom. Our freedom from what others have experienced, our freedom from the sense of limitation that others may be imagined to embody, our liberation from our sense of what the past has proposed or offered in terms of a representation of reality. Remember, I use as an example of all of these ideas the notion, the address to the question, is life real or dream? Is this a dream? We often hear that as one of the fundamental philosophical questions, one of the fundamental inquiries. And the way I answer that is, if we awaken one day to a totally different reality that persists, this was dream. That reality is a term of comparison. So philosophy at the limit of rigor achieves what Eliot is aspiring to, and achieves it more clearly and strongly. Now, fire in Eliot's writing is, as I said, a symbol of divinity. It can be an instrument of destruction, but also of purification, also of passionate intensity, the Pentecostal fire that represents being imbued with the Spirit of God, if you like. It's actually something that appears significantly early on in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. It begins in Exodus, where Moses, the Jewish patriarch, first encounters God. And God speaks to Moses and gives Moses directives for freeing the Jewish people, which again appears early within the Jewish tradition, from which the Christian tradition later emerges, from which the Islamic tradition later emerges. How does God address Moses? Through a burning bush. Here is how it's depicted in the Old Testament. Remember, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, it's Old Testament that represents the Jewish tradition, the New Testament that is the Christian faith, followed then by the Quran, which gives Islamic belief. But the Christian and the Islamic traditions all recognize that God was manifesting himself, herself, itself to humanity in the Old Testament. And that first explicit encounter is in Exodus, and here is the telling of it in the King James Bible, the translation of the Bible that was done around the time of Shakespeare and has been also a major influence upon the development of English, on modern English. Typically, people like Abraham Lincoln that mastered the English language and its abilities to move people, like in oratory, were influenced by the writings of Shakespeare and the writing of the King James Version of the Bible. So here is that section. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. So here we have a communication through fire, the Lord God manifesting himself, herself, itself to man in this burning bush, but it's also miraculous, not just in the appearance of God, but in the fact that it is a burning bush that does not get consumed by the flames. One of the fundamental themes of at least the Jewish tradition, but I think throughout the entire tradition of monotheism, is the ability of God to command the direction and the processes of nature. And so if God wants to intervene and change the course of events, that's what we call a miracle. The burning bush is such a miracle. Next, God says, "Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." In other words, God announces that now you are in the presence of God. I use that line in torture. That's a film that investigates human responses to the worst of circumstances. And I refer to different philosophical and religious writings asking the viewer of the film, is this strong enough to address the circumstance of extreme suffering? Right? That's one of the main preoccupations of my work. Right? Something that is strong enough in the face of the worst that we can experience. So, some of the other things that were in that work, in that film, are Shakespeare's. Men must endure their going hence, even as they're coming hither. Ripeness is all. Or Meister Eckhart, a Christian mystic, I am a something among some things, and so I go. Or Confucius, one world at a time. But for the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular, I chose those words where humanity encounters divinity. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the ground whereon thou standest is holy. In other words, we feel the embrace, the presence of that divine force, that divine fire. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. Extraordinary words. It's a tautology, really, right? Like, a man is a man. I am that I am. It's repeating itself. We have talked on a number of occasions about how tautologies mean. Tautologies are seen as foundational to logic, to logical form and representation. A equals A. But a tautology communicates deep wisdom by running counter to expectation, by freeing us from what we anticipate. We suffer our anticipations based upon the past, based upon our generalization of experience. When I say a man is, or I am, we're expecting a predicate other than a repetition of the same initial words. We're expecting a man is tall or strong or here or there, warrior in air, not a man is a man. So tautologies mean by denial of what we expect, denial of expectation. And that's the fundamental liberation that rigor achieves, and that even divinity embodies, in the sense that God can decide that the world will take a different course than it has in the past, and that we're imagining it will continue to take. God has that power in principle. Rigor establishes that power independent of any faith or belief in divinity. It's in the nature, fundamental nature of our circumstance, of the rigor of our circumstance. That the past cannot guarantee the future. Okay. Okay. The burning bush, the bush that through which God communicates to humanity in the Bible, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, brings to mind from the Hindu tradition, and I introduce this partly because T.S. Eliot was in mind of that tradition, and because fire plays such a central role in religious transcendence, in affecting the transfiguration of the individual from this world to the next, this life to the next, through the funeral pyre. But in Hinduism, there is a famous legend that doesn't deal with fire, but it does deal with a quivering bush, where the Lord Vishnu, one of the supreme Hindu deities, communicates to humanity in the way that God communicates to humanity in the Old Testament through a burning bush. The dominant metaphor in the Hindu legend, the Hindu story, involves water. But that's okay. I want to talk about that a little bit because water extinguishes fire, and I want to deal with the science of that as the middle section of this talk. But first, because it's a powerful story, it's a compelling story, and it gives a slightly different, well, another aspect of the relationship between divinity to humanity. I want to tell you about the story of Narada, a Hindu sage. The story is related in many places in Hindu literature, but I encountered it through Andre Malraux's Anti-Memoirs. I've referenced that book a lot. Let me show you. Here. Some more images that I wanted to show. In terms of the burning bush, here is a representation of Moses encountering the burning bush in the work of the 20th century painter Marc Chagall, a celebrated 20th century French Jewish painter. Narada is actually depicted here. He has a bowl of water on his head, and that is Vishnu standing in the midground. Here's the story of Narada. In the solitude of the forest, Narada meditates, his gaze fixed on a little shining leaf. The leaf begins to tremble. Soon the great tree, motionless in the luxuriant splendor above the sleeping peacocks, is quivering all over, as when the monsoon passes, it is Vishnu. So again, the spirit of divinity is inhabiting a bush, a tree. Choose between your desires, says the rustling of the leaves in the silence. Not fire, but the activity of leaves in the wind. What desire could I have except to know the secret of your Maya? Maya is a term for how humanity normally perceives the world around us. So be it, but go and fetch me some water. The tree is shimmering in the heat. The ascetic reaches the first hamlet and calls out. A young girl opens a door. Her voice was as a golden noose slipped round the neck of the strangers. He has forgotten the water. He will marry the girl, and they all expected him to marry her. Years go by. With the death of his father-in-law, he has become the head of the family. One night during the 12th year, the periodic floods drown the livestock and carry away the houses. The child he is carrying slips from his shoulder. He lets go of the two others and of his wife to pick it up again, but they are carried away. The thick torrent flings him onto a rock. When he regains consciousness, he is surrounded by nothing but a sea of mud through which there drift the corpses of trees full of monkeys. He weeps in the fading wind, my children, my children. My child, echoes the voice of the wind, becomes suddenly grave. Where is the water? I have been waiting more than half an hour. Vishnu awaits him in the motionless incandescence of the forest beside the great quivering tree. The idea is that our sense of reality is, within the Hindu tradition, not real. It's provisional. Philosophically, our claims about reality are provisional. They are presumptions. They're based upon our sense that the world will continue, objects will continue to perform, to behave, to demonstrate the same types of properties as they have in the past. That's fine for daily life. That's fine for developing our technologies. But in terms of the rigor of our circumstance, that is presumptive. And that's the ultimate imprisonment, that we presume more than we know to the end of time. Remember, we suffer not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. And when I say unjustifiably, I mean by the limiting tests of rigor. I've emphasized repeatedly, and I want to talk a little bit about the science of fire now, that science is not rigorous. It's not rigorous because controlled experiments are theoretically impossible. Controlled experiments are theoretically impossible for one reason: the world is different in different directions. But it turns out, and this is an aphorism I just wrote tonight, that controlled experiments are impossible in every possible world. If a controlled experiment were possible, we could not exist. We'll talk about that later, another time. But I bring up water in that Narada story in relation to fire. And as I said, one of the main connections is that water puts out fire. Why? What's the science of that? Why does water put out fire? Well, there are actually a number of aspects to it, but here's the most important chemically. Let me show you something. That is the chemical equation that involves the burning. Burning is combination with oxygen, O2. That is a carbohydrate. It could be glucose. It's made up of 3 elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Glucose, a form of sugar, is the most abundant organic chemical in the world. It's part of our bodies. It's part of every plant, every animal. It's abundantly common in the world. When a tree burns, it's mostly some form of carbohydrate, or among other things, things made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and other elements that are combining with oxygen to form the 2 main products, CO2 and H2O. When a carbohydrate like glucose burns, you just get CO2, carbon dioxide, and water, H2O. The important aspect of that relationship is that when wood burns, common products are water and carbon dioxide. Those are the products of the reaction. Chemical reactions can go in both directions. Burning involves the reaction going in the direction of, the arrow you see. We're starting with glucose or with organic compounds, things made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and other elements, but those are among the most important. Combining with oxygen to create new molecules, new chemical forms. It's a chemical reaction because there are new chemical substances, new bonds forming. But chemical reactions in principle can go in both directions. To stop the reaction, we would like the reaction to go backwards. And a way to drive a chemical reaction backwards is to add product. When you add CO2, which is what fire extinguishers commonly do, or when you add water, in principle, you're helping to reverse the reaction. And reversing that reaction amounts to stopping the burning. That's one explanation. That's actually probably the most important in terms of fundamental principles of chemistry. Now, we burn. Joan of Arc burned. We burn. Burns are, and I'm going to talk about this, some of the most horrific injuries we can experience. there's a reason why we are capable of burning. It turns out that we are thermodynamically unstable. What that means is, it's as if we are on a mountaintop, and a ball, for example, on top of a mountain will have a tendency to roll down under the influence of gravity. Chemically, we're on a mountaintop with our forms, our chemical substances, and their organization in our body. We are highly ordered, highly organized as living things. We are unstable. If given the chance, we will chemically roll down the hill. Now here's a way to kind of picture the basic idea. We are chemically at number 1. Number 3 is what we convert into when we are burned, when wood is burned. Wood starts at 1 and goes to 3. It's going downhill chemically. Now, when we're talking about gravity, when we're talking about rolling down a hill, we're rolling down under the influence of gravitational attraction. In the case of a chemical change, going downhill involves a change in something called the Gibbs free energy. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but I'm bringing it up because Gibbs, J.W. Gibbs, was a great 19th century American theoretical chemist. Let me show you what Gibbs looked like. And there's some interesting things to say about Gibbs. Here is J.W. Gibbs. You don't know the name. He was a professor at Yale. He wasn't particularly interested in being famous. I think I've made the point that people are not famous by accident. You have to want to be. Ian Wilmot is not famous, and yet he's responsible for perhaps the single most important experimental result in the history of biology, the ability to clone. When I was in molecular biology, that was seen as the holy grail to achieve cloning. Everyone was obsessed with it. He achieved it. He could be as celebrated as Darwin, as Einstein, but we don't know his name because he didn't pursue fame. The same thing for Gibbs. Gibbs's results arguably are at the level in chemistry of the significance of Einstein's results in physics. The Gibbs free energy accounts for the direction of chemical reactions, why we burn. Accounts for, well, diamond, for example, over time. Well, diamond is unstable. It's highly ordered. It's unstable. Diamond, over time, will convert to graphite, to pencil lead. All those diamonds that people have spent millions of dollars for, over time, because they are thermodynamically unstable, will convert to graphite, to pencils. But it'll take a long time. And the reason that it will take a long time is that there are 2 factors that control a chemical reaction, that control whether or not we burn, that control whether or not diamond becomes graphite. One is what Gibbs was concerned with, the thermodynamics of the relationship, namely that we start out uphill thermodynamically and end up downhill. That is the direction in which burning takes us, from here to there. That's the direction of the transformation of diamond into pencil lead. We're going downhill chemically, thermodynamically. That's how we refer to that process, again, of going downhill chemically in chemical terms. We talk about thermodynamics. And by the way, thermodynamics was the field of science that Einstein most admired. Einstein felt that was the one branch of science that would remain standing at the end of time, that it would never be overturned by subsequent discoveries or developments, thermodynamics. But notice, to go from here, number 1, to number 3 is not just a matter of sliding downhill. It's a matter of first getting over a hump, getting over a little mountain elevation in between. It's that hump that prevents us from spontaneously burning. It's that hump that prevents diamond from, in our hands, turning into pencil lead. If that hump wasn't there, we would take a handful of diamond from the ground and watch in a matter of seconds or minutes or hours as it turned to dust. If that hump were not there, we would step out into our atmosphere, rich with oxygen, and spontaneously combust. Yes. Now, as with a hill, it takes energy to go up to the top and then go all the way down, right? That energy is what's provided by fire. Fire, a match, will take us from where we are here up to number 2. That allows us then to slide all the way downhill to CO2 and H2O, to ash. But we need to be ignited because of that hump. But we burn it all because the products of burning living things, of burning wood, of burning anything made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, is down there, CO2, H2O. So we say we would spontaneously go from 1 to 3. We don't, simply because of the hill that we have to climb in between. That's the barrier that protects us. But that's the barrier that fire is able to overcome when it ignites something. Now, when we go from glucose, C6H12O6, that molecule, when that combines with oxygen to give us CO2 and H2O, we're forming different molecules. Molecules are made up of chemical bonds. It's as if atoms are holding hands, being held together. We are changing the arrangements of the atoms in these molecules when we go from one substance, from glucose, to another set of substances, carbon dioxide and water. We are forming chemical bonds, forming new chemical bonds, chemical associations between atoms. And by the way, all the basic elements in our world that are capable of forming chemical bonds are given in the periodic table of elements. There are a little bit over 100 elements. Most are natural, some are man-made there in that table now. Anyway, but chemical elements are capable of combining, of forming chemical bonds. Hydrogen and oxygen are elements that are capable of combining to form water. Carbon and oxygen are elements that are capable of combining together, forming chemical bonds, links that allow carbon dioxide to form. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen are individual elements that are able to come together in the right numbers, in the right arrangements in space, and form molecules like glucose. That's our main source of energy. So, chemical bonds are ultimately responsible for the form of the world that we see. what causes, what is a chemical bond. Now, I know the science here, I don't want to get overly technical, but one almost never hears that question addressed. Why do chemical bonds form at all? Why do atoms link up at all? What is the driving principle behind the association of individual elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, into the molecules, the groupings that form everything around us and that make human life possible, that make our world possible? What is driving that ultimately? You know, we think in terms of like forces of attraction when we think of gravity, but the question is, what's a force? Einstein tried to explain gravity in terms of the basic architecture of space. So we're trying to understand things, not just give it a term, give it a name. Well, the issue of what allows chemical bonds to form is ultimately philosophical, and that's why I bring it up here. And again, I'm not going to be able to go into all the intricacies of it, but it was only addressed ever in my education. And again, I've obviously had a lot of science education, you know, at Harvard, at UCLA, in graduate programs, in undergraduate programs, in medical school. It was only ever addressed once by Frank Westheimer, one of the world's great organic chemists teaching at Harvard. He was also, under President Johnson in the 1960s, a member of the National Advisory Council for advising the president on scientific issues. Well, here is Westheimer. Frank Westheimer. Very famous, an extraordinary professor at Harvard. I took his organic chemistry course. It was a one-year course. It was the only course at Harvard in which I ever took notes. It was also the only course that I ever attended regularly. I attended every class and wrote down everything he said. And he basically would come to class with a little note card and glance down at the note card, and then write on the board all the chemical reactions, all the mechanisms of reactions that he wanted to discuss. He wanted to discuss the principles that governed and that these reactions illustrated. I met Westheimer under interesting circumstances. Let me tell you that quickly. I know I'm not going to be able to get to everything I wanted to. If I don't, maybe we'll continue some of this next time. But I transitioned from philosophy to medicine when I was a second semester junior in college, because at that point I had been doing philosophy for almost 10 years, you know, on my own and then in college, and I needed a break from it. I had gone as far as I could without having time to gestate, to develop results. So I transitioned. I decided to start taking science courses. That led me to molecular biology and medicine. But in order to get into medical school, one has to take a certain number of prerequisite courses: organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, biology, physics. Well, I didn't have time as a second semester junior at Harvard to take all of those courses. I had to take what was available. It turns out that in the middle of the year, when I was making that transition, inorganic chemistry, which is almost always taken before organic chemistry, wasn't available to start the course. But organic chemistry with Frank Westheimer was available at the middle of the year, so I could take that course but the problem was I didn't have the requirements for it. I hadn't taken inorganic chemistry at Harvard, and organic chemistry as it is considered one of the hardest of the undergraduate courses. But it turns out that at Harvard there's often exceptions for almost anything. if you had gotten, well, a perfect score on a high school like standardized test in chemistry, which I had, you, in principle, could take the course, could take organic chemistry without having taken inorganic first, if you got the professor's specific permission, approval. That meant meeting with Frank Westheimer. Okay? You know, what? 20, 19, I'm young. But even younger, actually. And Frank Westheimer is one of the world's preeminent scientists. I go into his office and he asks me, you know, what I'm doing there. And I said, I'm interested in getting permission to take organic chemistry, even though I haven't taken inorganic. And he immediately erupts. And he says, you know, sternly, it's because of people like you that organic chemistry has such a bad reputation. People taking the course without adequate preparation, without the necessary background. Okay, so he's not happy with my request. He's not happy with me. But then he asked me, what are you studying here? What are you majoring in? Actually, at Harvard, it's called concentration. What are you concentrating in? And I said, philosophy. Now, you would think that that would be the death knell, right? Philosophy, and you want to take organic chemistry without inorganic, you're wasting my time. But that's not what happened. He said to me, you know, I can't claim to know much philosophy. I don't really have a background in philosophy. But my sense of the subject is that it's either the easiest of all academic subjects to pursue, or it's the most difficult. And my further sense is that how philosophy is done at Harvard represents the most difficult of all subjects. And in fact, Harvard's philosophy department, along with its math department, had the reputation, at the time at least, of being one of the two most difficult academic departments at any university in the entire academic world. I heard that from many professors at different universities. So Westheimer said, you can take the course. So I took the course, but interestingly, he admitted not to having a strong philosophical background. The reason I mention that story is, one day, early in the course, he addressed the question that I began that anecdote with, why do chemical bonds form at all? Which would ultimately be behind the question, why we burn at all? Why we are capable of existing at all? Why do chemical bonds between different elements ever come about? And he said the answer is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. That, and again, not to get too complicated here, but Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is a philosophic principle ultimately. Heisenberg was doing the physics of existentialism. It's the idea that you cannot claim about a physical system what you cannot in principle know. That is the fundamental epistemological impulse behind the entire Western philosophical tradition. That's what grounds rigor. Well, imagine a room like this room. Imagine there's a mouse in the room. Okay? If I turn on the light, the mouse is going to run away. So, but let's say there's a mouse here, the room is dark, and I want to be able to determine where the mouse is and where it's going, if it's in motion. What you want to do is have the light as dim as possible, because having the light as dim as possible will disturb the mouse the least. But the dimmer the light, the less well you're going to be able to see the mouse. So it turns out that that's sort of relates to this fundamental physical principle, one of the most important in all of physics, the basis of quantum mechanics, the idea that you are limited in terms of your knowledge of systems, like systems of atoms. And the more the energy that you use to observe the system, the less certain you can be of where something is within the room, because it runs away. Or in the other way, the less energy you use to observe the system, the more, in principle, you'll be able to locate the object, but the less clearly you can see it. And so where it is becomes kind of blurry. Ultimately, what that principle amounts to is that the greater the uncertainty, the space of a system, the larger the system, the lower the energy associated with that system can be. The minimum energy of a system is the uncertainty of the energy, and the minimum energy corresponds to being downhill at the bottom of a hill. Forming a chemical bond amounts to going from here, where you're in a small confined space, to down here, where you're in a much larger space and are free to move throughout a larger space. When chemical bonds form, when atoms come together, the electrons, the basic elements, ingredients that are responsible for that bond, are able to move not through just the space of one atom or two atoms, but many atoms. The greater the space, the greater the freedom of movement, the lower the energy of the system. That's the driving force behind chemical bonds. That's the driving force behind the substances of our world, including the substances that make our cells. And even though that explanation is not going to be like perfectly clear, I understand. The point to make here is that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is grounded in philosophy, is grounded in the entire Socratic tradition of what you cannot know, you do not claim. Heisenberg, when developing that principle and developing quantum mechanics, was doing the physics of existentialism, of the circumstance that you have to describe the world from within the world, and when you're in the world and trying to describe the world, you're necessarily disturbing the world, and you're disturbing it in unpredictable ways, and that disturbance of the world is what creates the uncertainties that lead to all of the strange aspects of quantum mechanics, which is one of the great theories in the history of human thought. Okay, so I know not all of that will be crystal clear, but at least some of the connections, I think, you get the sense of. Now, we have the capacity to burn, right? We are here. If you light us, we go here, and then we tumble down there to ash. Burns are horrific. Burns are among the worst injuries that one can suffer. And let me give you a slight instance of that. I've mentioned in the past my introduction to science reading. There was a book club that my parents subscribed to for me, the Library of Science. When I was 10, I got a physics textbook from it. I've referenced that in some of these talks. It's also in Phalaris's Bull, where I read it night after night, very slowly, without much comprehension at the beginning, but I persisted, and eventually relativity and quantum mechanics became intuitive to me. That formed the basis of my understanding of the physical sciences, those kinds of early experiences when I was 10, 11. But before that, before the Library of Science, which offered college textbooks, my parents subscribed to something called Time Life books. And let me show you a Time Life book. These were at a much less sophisticated level, but sophisticated enough for somebody. I was maybe 7 or 8 or even 9 at the time when I was reading them. Here is an example of one of these books on the cell. Now, that particular book, and they would come once a month, and they would consist of maybe 10 chapters. Each chapter would have text, maybe 10, 15, 20 pages of text, and then a photo essay, maybe 10 pages of photographs illustrating some particular topic in relation to the chapter. Well, that particular book, The Cell, had a chapter on cell regeneration, of the ability of the body to repair itself. And it used an example. It started out with a photo essay that had a large fold-out, and I have a description of it actually. From the first version I wrote of Phalaris's Bull, I ended up removing this from the final version, but let me read you what was in the original version of Phalaris's Bull about my encounter with that book. The Cell, whose chapter on cell regeneration had a photo essay that began with a fold-out, a big glossy picture of a baby with third-degree burns over 95% of its body. I taped the pages shut. I never wanted to see it again. The horror of that image was overwhelming, especially to someone, 7, 8, 9. I never looked at that page again. When I was in college, I had a friend who was applying to medical school. He was volunteering in a laboratory, in a research laboratory, in order to help enhance his application, his chances of being accepted. I mean, even though we were at Harvard, in those days anyway, it was highly competitive to get into any medical school, regardless of the college you were from. So he was doing volunteer work. And the laboratory of this professor, who was also a physician, was in this building, I will show you, in Boston. This building. And that building is the building of the Shriner Burn Hospital. Now, this professor, this researcher, was not doing research in burns, but because his laboratory space was under the funding of the Shrine Burn Institute, the Shrine Burn Foundation, in exchange for the privilege of having that laboratory, this professor, this doctor, had to make rounds of the burn wards once a month. And he said that was the limit of what he could tolerate. That's, again, how horrific burns are, right? Now, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go faster here. When I was applying to medical school myself, one of the schools I applied to was the University of Michigan. And the interview was done with a physician in Los Angeles. I went to this physician's office. He had patients, so I waited in the waiting room. And while I was waiting in the waiting room, I was looking through some magazines. There was a Time magazine that he happened to have. The Time magazine had an article in its medical section on burn treatment. I was reading it while I was waiting. When I went in for the interview, the physician asked me what I was doing while I was waiting, and I told him I was reading an article in your Time magazine on burns and treating burns. And he said to me, okay, here's how you treat burns. When I was in the Korean War, I was with a group of fellow soldiers. There was an artillery attack. There were 4 of us. 3 of my fellow soldiers were severely burned, 3rd-degree burns. 2 of them died within hours of their burns, of their injuries. A third of equally severe 3rd-degree burns happened to fall into a cold running stream of water. He was there overnight. The next day, he was able to emerge from that stream, that cold running stream, virtually healed of his burns. The physician said to me, "Sir, I don't care what you ever hear in medicine under any circumstances. In order to treat a burn, you run the burn, no matter what type of burn, under cold running water until the burning stops. If that's 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes. If it's 10 hours, it's 10 hours until the burning stops." And some years later, I actually burned myself severely on a halogen light in my garage when I was doing some artwork. I followed that advice. I burned the side of my leg, my thigh. I went into the shower, ran cold water on it for half an hour, stopped, still burned, went back in another half hour, then another half hour, then another half hour. I was in the shower with cold water running on my leg for maybe 2.5 hours. There was no scarring. That's how you treat burns. Cold running water until the pain stops. It's one of the most valuable lessons I have ever learned in a medical context. And I learned it during an interview, which is an illustration of how we can learn anywhere. And we have to be open to what various circumstances offer us. Very few physicians know what I've just told you. Okay, I talk about burns partly because of the horror of them. I address it in the books of Joshua. I've read this before, but let me read it again. Quickly here before I get to the questions. Dostoevsky, Cervantes, and Defoe took Malraux to torture his heart, and Picasso, overwrought, received him with a blinding start. The order of things unjustifiably brings an innocent girl to the torturer's cart. Such a world were better left to spin itself apart. And Job is an ode to barbarity, despite the mode of deity, or whatever it claims to be. So imagine yourself burned half alive, then see what justification can survive. The point is, the driving force between much of my philosophical work is what is strong enough in the presence of those extreme horrors, those extreme challenges, right? Philosophy is singular to answer the horror now and to the beginning and end of time with one question: is our logic stronger than our pain? The logic that is stronger than our pain is the logic that pertains at the limit of rigor. The epistemic logic, A is not equal to A, the logic that deconceptualizes our world, strips it of concepts in the way that Buddhist systems of belief strip the world of concepts, but grounded in belief. Philosophy achieves that result through rigor. And I tell people, if you are at the extremity of pain, if you are faced with the extremity of horror, you had better be able to strip the reality bare. You had better be able to strip the world of its concepts. That's the power of rigor at the end of our investigation. But it's not something that one can just snap on fingers and do, though the philosophy does act like a switch. But in my experience, that's the only thing strong enough to rise to the occasion of the challenges in their extremity of human life. And a couple of things from Joshua that attend to that. For salvation is extreme as life to dream, and God is a magician, mathematician, working assumptionlessly, circumscribed by certainty. God embodies at the highest rigor. We suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. It is rigor that frees us from our presumptions, even as to the worst of our circumstances. Now, questions. I know I don't have that much time, but these questions kind of all relate to basic philosophical principles that I've been articulating. And so they can kind of be answered at great length, but also, I think, summarily. What is the philosophy of life? When we're talking about philosophy and its understanding of life, we're talking about a world of rigorous representation. And so we're talking about that which deconceptualizes our space. We are talking about that which frees us from our presumptions. And I say, embrace that. Embrace the rigor of our circumstance, then act according to your nature, your circumstances, that no one else can fully intuit, that no one else can assess. What is the philosophy of will, freedom, and responsibility? Again, you enter the epistemic, you embrace rigorous representation. That is the point of absolute freedom, absolute dignity. Everything else is a presumption against it. When we talk about limitations of will, limitations of freedom, all of those limitations are pertaining to arising within a heuristic space, a space that has certain instrumental values or benefits, can promote our survival, can promote the well-being of a society in terms of our ability to cooperate, to cohere, to work together. But in terms of what achieves salvation, a complete solution here and now and independently of all future experience, that's the opposite direction. That's in the embrace of rigor. I know I keep using that term over and over again because I've emphasized that we don't even need to use the word philosophy. All we're talking about here is rigorous representation at its limit. And how should humans be prepared for death? Remember, I've talked about the earthquake experience where I encountered death. I was within a millimeter or two of the building collapsing on me that I was in, and structural engineers that came afterwards said that it was a miracle it didn't collapse, and I was convinced that I was about to die. So I was brought to face with death during the Northridge earthquake. And remember, I ran through an aphorism, selflessness, how one acts not out of need. It did nothing to assuage the terror, the horror, but then I ran a fundamental logical aphorism. The meaning of the world is its most general representation through my mind, which puts things in perspective from the limit of generality, which is also the limit of rigor, and the anguish, the agony, the fear, the terror stopped as if I had turned a switch. So the ultimate response to death is the embrace of rigorous representation. But as I emphasized, don't wait too long. You don't want to be at the moment of death grasping for or at the philosophy. You want to understand it, understand how it works, which is simply to understand the nature of rigor, that we exist in difference from everything else, and difference eviscerates all of our presumptions. That is the ultimate source of our suffering. And I use the aphorism, we suffer, but we presume more than we know to the end of time. That is strong enough for the moment of death. Okay.
So So thank you very much, Stephen, for the talks. Thank you for answering the questions. One more time, we would like to give big thanks to our speaker. Also, you, the audience, for being active. We see all the feedback, all the thumbs up. Please make sure to address your questions. We'll definitely address them at the end of the next session. And stay safe. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you again,
Bye.
and thank you,
Thank you very
Aaliyah.
much, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.